This is a video on a chemistry revision series, and the topic for today is kinetic particle theory. Here is an overview of what we are going to cover. We will look at the background of the kinetic particle theory, or KPT in short, the properties of the three states of matter, change in states of matter from one to the other. Then we'll look at some cooling curves and heating curves, and finally we will look at this concept of diffusion. Now the background of KPT will bring us to think about two questions. The first one is, what is KPT? And it is basically the fact that all particles are in constant random motion. Now you might recall that there is an experiment called the Brownian motion that was able to show that particles are always moving, and it is never possible to predict how they move. Therefore, we say that they are always moving, constantly moving, and since it is unpredictable, the motion is described to be random. Now, another thing that we can think about is why learn KPT and what is the use of KPT? Now, KPT will allow us to describe the three states of matter accurately, as well as to talk about the differences in the properties of the three states of matter. And finally, we are able to explain why there are differences in the properties of the three states of matter when they are changed from one to the other. And therefore, we come to this part about the properties of these three states of matter. You might have seen this diagram before, and it really summarizes everything that you need to know with regard to the arrangement, movement, and the attractive forces of the particles in the three states of matter. Now, the keywords that have been underlined are really, really important, and you should make sure that you remember how to phrase these words together, because when you're asked to explain about the arrangement of the particles, you have to use these keywords. Likewise, remember the movement of the particles from one state to another. They are also quite specific. And finally, the attractive forces should also be remembered. And just to want to highlight this point, that between solids and liquids, the attractive forces are actually very strong. It's just that the forces in solids are much stronger than those in liquids. Another thing we can talk about will be the shape as well as the compressibility of the three states of matter. And again, you should be familiar with this from your knowledge in science from your earlier years. These are two important concepts that I have summarized into two questions in the form of a flowchart. Now, these two questions are namely, number one, can it be compressed? And number two, can the shape be changed? These two questions will help you to identify whether something is a gas, a liquid, or a solid. And I hope that this flowchart will help you to some sort of categorize and organize your thoughts a little bit here. Now we come to the next part about the change in states of matter. And the background is that you should know the various names of the processes that take place when there is a change in state from one to the other. We have melting, we have boiling, and in reverse from gas to liquid, we have condensation, eventually freezing, and of course the most special one is from a solid to a gas, that is sublimation. And apart from knowing the various processes, we have to learn about the application of these three states of matter. And a way to apply your knowledge is to know how to determine the states of the substances at, for example, room temperature, or it can be any other specified temperature. Now, I am giving you four substances with the melting points and boiling points stated. You should hit the pause button and try to think about what are the states at 25 degrees Celsius, otherwise at room temperature. Now, I hope that you have managed to hit the pause button to think about what states they will be. We will now go through that particular problem. Now, these are the states of the substances A, B, C, and D. I hope that you have gotten all of them correct. Now, we look at some of the cooling curves as well as the heating curves. And a cooling curve is basically a curve that shows you as time progresses, the temperature of the substance is decreasing. And in this case, you realize that as it decreases, it reaches a horizontal portion xy that does not change at all. And this temperature is 69 degrees Celsius. That process is freezing. And of course, the temperature there will be called the freezing point. What exactly happens during freezing? Now remember the three things that help us to talk about in KPT will be the arrangement, the movement, as well as the attractive forces. And therefore, when you are describing what happens between the particles, you should focus on these three things: arrangement, movement, and attractive forces. Now this is for freezing, and the other change in state that is typically involved in the cooling curves will be that of condensation. And similarly, you realize that over here for condensation, I have also included portions about the arrangement of the particles, the movement of particles, as well as the attractive forces between the particles. Okay, next, we come to this portion called the heating curve, which is the exact opposite of a cooling curve. As time progresses, you realize the temperature is increasing, and this time there are two horizontal portions, BC as well as DE. Now for BC, what process is taking place? Think about this before I proceed. I hope that you have managed to answer it correctly. It is melting. And because it is horizontal at that portion, we call that temperature its melting point. And the higher, the horizontal line that is higher up there, okay, that will be the boiling point because boiling is taking place there. And again, in terms of melting as well as boiling, the description of the particles with regard to KPT will always be talking about three main points: the arrangement of the particles, the movement, as well as the attractive forces. Therefore, these key phrases that have been underlined are very important in ensuring that you are clear about what is required of you. Remember, the three things will be the arrangement of the particles, the movement of the particles, as well as the attractive forces between the particles. Now you realize that I've been talking about boiling so far in the heating curve, but I did not mention evaporation. This is because boiling and evaporation are different. And this table here summarizes the differences between your boiling and evaporation processes. Boiling is something that occurs only at one temperature, which is the boiling point, while evaporation occurs at temperatures that are below the boiling point. Things can evaporate at temperatures like room temperature. Evaporation also can take place. And boiling occurs throughout the liquid. However, for evaporation, it only occurs at the surface of the liquid. And finally, for boiling, you realize that things can boil off very quickly, but evaporation is usually a much slower process. Now we come to this final portion of diffusion in the kinetic particle theory. Now diffusion is basically the movement of the particles from a region of higher concentration to one that has a low concentration. And diffusion really provides evidence that particles exist and particles are always moving and there is no predictable way to find out how these particles move. You notice that there are two experiments shown in the diagrams. The first one is when you have two gas jars uh, that are separated with a card, and one contains the bromine vapor, the other one is normal air that is colorless. And when that layer is removed, you realize the bromine vapor will spread throughout very quickly, just within a few minutes. And likewise, if I have a conical flask and I add in uh, some liquid water, after adding in a few drops of coloring, you notice the, the whole conical flask of colorless liquid will turn blue. That's how kinetic particle theory is shown to be true, because these particles are always moving, and that's why there is that spread of the color throughout the space there. And diffusion is affected by two things. Now, the first thing that diffusion is affected by will be the relative molecular mass. And in general, this is the rule. When the gas is heavier, it will diffuse more slowly. And of course, conversely, when the gas is lighter, it will also diffuse more quickly. Now, I have three gases here: oxygen, carbon dioxide, as well as methane. And I've also given you the MR. Now, I trust that you know how to calculate the MR of any given gas. And I would like you to take a few seconds to think about what is the order in which the gas diffuse. I hope that you have managed to guess correctly that the lightest gas in this case is methane, and this will be the first gas to diffuse out of a particular system. The next gas that can diffuse out will be oxygen. And finally, the heaviest gas, CO2, this will be the last gas to diffuse out of a system. I hope you have gotten the order correct. And now let's move on to the second factor that affects diffusion. It is temperature. And in general, this rule states that the higher the temperature, the faster the rate of diffusion. This means that if, let's say, I have a temperature at room temperature, 25 degrees Celsius, it will be slower than at a higher temperature of, let's say, 40 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Celsius. And the reason for this is because when there is a higher temperature, the particles move more quickly, they have more energy, and therefore diffusion is taking place at an increased pace. Now we look at some application questions, and I'm very sure this diagram is familiar to you. Now I have the beaker as well as the porous pot system and the U-shaped tube. And the question, of course, will be, what will happen to the water level at point X? And in this case, you have to look at the MR values of ammonia as well as carbon dioxide. And they are given there in the slide. Now you realize that ammonia has a smaller or a lower MR compared to carbon dioxide, and therefore it can diffuse more quickly into the pot rather than CO2 diffusing out of the pot. And because there are going to be more particles within the porous pot, it will cause the water level at X to fall. It will be pushing through and causing the water level at X to fall. Now, this will be the immediate change. And imagine, okay, if let's say a long time is given for this whole experiment to be conducted, then after some time, again, okay, your ammonia and carbon dioxide will diffuse out of the porous pot such that the concentration of the ammonia and carbon dioxide in the beaker and porous pot will be equal. And this means that the water level will rise up again to level X. Okay, but this is going to take place much later. Usually the question will want you to think about the immediate change in the water level, and the immediate change would be dependent on the MR of the two gases. Now here we have a second application question, and the two gases now will be nitrogen as well as carbon monoxide. Now hit the pause button and try to think about what is going to happen at the water level at point X. And once you're done, you can unpause this video and continue to listen to the answer. I hope you have taken some time to think about this whole problem. Now again, we'll look at the MR values of nitrogen as well as carbon monoxide. And in this case, they both happen to have the same MR. Now, therefore, this means that the rate of diffusion will be the same, and there is no change in the water level at X. Did you get this correct? Now let's look at the third application question. In this setup, I've changed the gases to nitrogen in the beaker and helium in the porous pot. Again, what will happen to the water level at point X immediately? Hit the pause button to think things through before you proceed. I hope you have managed to have some time to think things through. And what will happen is, again, compare the MR of these two gases. For nitrogen, it is 28, and for helium, it is 4. And since the MR of helium is so small, much smaller than nitrogen, it's going to diffuse out of the porous pot, and it will cause the water level at X to rise. Because in that sense, there is a vacuum in the porous pot, and therefore the water level will rise to occupy the space that was left by the helium diffusing out of the porous pot. Now, I hope that you have managed to get all the three application questions correct. And we've come to the end of this video. Now, to recap, we have really looked through the background of the KPT. We have looked through the properties of the states of matter and emphasized on the three things: the arrangement, the movement, as well as the attractive forces of the particles. We have looked through the change in states of matter, as well as the cooling curves and heating curves, and learning how to describe what happens when there is a change in state by focusing on the three areas: the arrangement, the movement, and the attractive forces between the particles. And finally, we looked at diffusion, where we saw how diffusion can be affected by two factors. And we also looked at a few application questions involving diffusion. Now, this is the end of this video. I hope that you have the chance to think things through to try out all the questions. And if you have any other questions, feel free to post them down in the comments section. And do like and share this video. Thank you.